Welcome to the Visionary podcast, where we discuss science, medicine, physical health, and mental well-being. Dr. Paula Redmond, please complete this sentence for us. Work hurts when
our humanity is not recognised, when it's difficult for us to be human alongside our professional identities.
How do you define humanity within workplace that is hectic, that is busy, that is super demanding?
I think it's on a few levels. I think the one is about just our bodies, what our bodies need, and being able to recognise that, we need to go to the toilet, we need to be hydrated, we need to eat, we need to rest, that there's an impact of being in really clinical environments where there's no natural light, where everything is hard and plastic and metal.
Yes.
And that does impact us. That's not our natural environment to be in. So there's one part is the physicality, the embodied experience of working in these contexts. The other part of our humanity is our emotional self, and the fact that doing this work, which, in healthcare, is really about being with distress and pain. And if that's something that we are exposed to a lot, it impacts us. It impacts our nervous systems. And, as professionals, we for sure develop skills and ways of managing that and of containing that and of a kind of distance and separation. But we can't do that completely without becoming very cut off in ways that are harmful. So being able to acknowledge and notice the impact of working with being exposed to distress and pain and suffering.
Yeah.
Really
a friend who's a psychologist told me that every psychologist must have a psychologist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
okay. Another sentence that needs completion. Work heals when?
Work heals, I think, when it allows us to experience contribution and the sense of purpose in ways that don't take more than they give. So work is, one of the biggest relationships we will have in our lives. We're going to spend more time in work than with anyone else.
Yes.
So just as with any relationship, it goes through different phases, different seasons, and it's not always about fun.
It's never about fun. Is it any fun for anyone? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, it can be. We can derive great pleasure and meaning from work. And most people in healthcare will be coming into this profession not necessarily with wounds, but with tendencies towards caring for other people, because that's a role that has been important to us.
Yeah, they were trained to look after others.
Yeah, socialised for whatever reason into that role. And so I think when work allows us to meet that need in ways that, create meaning and, nurturing our sense of purpose and learning and connection, that can be very important and very healing.
You've dedicated over 15 years of your life to the NHS as a clinical psychologist, caring for older adults during some of one of the most incredible, challenging moments of their lives. Now you have taken that experience to independent, private practice. What did that work with NHS teach you about human suffering and resilience?
Yeah.
It's a big question, I know, but
yeah.
we want the gist of your experience.
I guess, working a lot, I worked in, older adult mental health services, and a lot of that was dementia care. And, partly that's about being with people at the beginning of that journey, the diagnostic process, which is very, can be very difficult, and imparting really difficult news, and working with families, as well as working with people in later stages in care homes, and, struggling with supporting staff, caring for people who might have had really, behaviours that were challenging to the system. And I guess, there is something about a common humanity in that, I suppose dementia in particular is something that none of us are immune from, that there is, obviously there are things that we can do to reduce risk, but not to eliminate it. And the impact that has on people and on their families is, shared, no matter what kind of sector of society or, what your history is. That's really difficult. So there's something about that common humanity for patients and families, but I suppose also very much thinking about the systems that people live in. So thinking about care homes, what it's like for those staff providing that care in really challenging and often very undervalued circumstances.
Yes.
And NHS teams, older adults in particular, is a very under-resourced, undervalued sector. Mental health care as well in this country doesn't have parity with physical health care. So you're working with very limited resources, and often what it boils down to is that sense of being able to maintain compassion for the people we work with and for ourselves in the midst of very tough circumstances, very depleted circumstances.
And during those years with NHS, what was happening then that made you aware of the mental health crisis facing health professionals today in the UK?
Well, I guess partly, seeing that in my colleagues.
Have you experienced that yourself?
I have experienced, I guess, what would be probably, looking back, burnout, and very high kind of stress in relation to some of the interpersonal conflict that can happen in teams. So, I think that's a major cause of the strain and the mental health, the suffering that health workers experience. Is sometimes it's about
competition
and bullying, and that kind of the toxicity that can happen in environments where you're trying to do a lot with very little, and so there's strain in terms of workload, there's strain in terms of the cognitive and emotional pressures of the work. I worked in the NHS for 15 years or so, and the change that even being in the same trust, the organisational changes that happened were constant, and that's very exhausting and very stressful for people. So it's this holding this, like the nature of the work, which is cognitively, emotionally very challenging, and a system that's not often set up to support that and is in constant flux and under threat.
Hi, I'm Hala, your host today. If you're enjoying what you see, please hit that lovely subscribe button. It will mean a lot to us. Or maybe a small podcast now, but with your support, we can build this channel together, one step at a time. Thank you so much for being part of it. You've mentioned feeling, and I quote you, I think, bruised and battered by unrelenting demands and inhumane working system. Was that the first thing that whispered in your ears that work can hurt people?
Yeah, I think there's something really important about that. What I'd be able to name now, which I wasn't able to name then, about moral injury, about the gap between the care that you want to provide and what's possible.
Moral injury, explain that to us, please.
So moral injury is a term that has come out of the experiences of veterans and armed forces who have experienced something that is different to PTSD, so different to, having been through a traumatic event and being, disturbed and distressed by that long after the event itself is finished. There's something additional that people were describing about the sense of being complicit in acts that transgress their moral code. So being part of operations, in wars where they had to do things that they knew were wrong.
Yeah, how would that manifest as live in a doctor's daily practice, for example?
Yeah, so often it's things like witnessing corridor care.
Corridor care.
Yeah.
Like this is conducting appointments in the corridor.
Yeah, or people, in hospital in A&E, they're left in the corridor for hours because there aren't any bays.
Wow.
Ambulances being stacked up outside the hospital because there's, nowhere for them to go. Having to discharge people when there's no adequate social care, at home.
Or maybe because there aren't enough beds.
Or there's not enough beds. In mental health care, that's often about waiting lists, or, you've only got 6 sessions and someone's got really complex problems. 6 sessions is, they've waited 2 years for 6 sessions.
Yes.
It's, thinking about working with children where, children are, suicidal and admitting to hospital that's 500 miles away and that's the only option. Those kind of things that's
painful.
Are really painful. And being sort of like that sense of you're part of that. You don't agree with it, but you're part of that system.
But what can be done? I mean, just to draw a reality check. This is a system. These are capabilities. The resources are very short. How do doctors and nurses usually conceptualize this? This is sad and bad, but this is the best that we can do. How do they survive this moral injury?
Well, I think what is so important is naming it, is noticing it and naming it. And that is often doesn't happen.
And when you do that within a specific system, let's just draw a realistic picture. You're in a medical center and you're witnessing something that's against your values and morals. Does naming that and would change things usually, or no?
Well, I guess what often happens is we have an experience that causes suffering. And then as humans, we add a layer to that, which is self-criticism often, or shame, or I'm not good enough because I'm feeling this way. So the doctor who goes into, who's in A&E, who's seeing, this corridor care, who's looking around and everyone is acting like this is normal.
Normal for them, maybe.
Yeah, may go home, feeling awful, but not having the only, often what people do is then make the leap to, there's something wrong with me that I can't cope with this. Like I need to be better. That's where burnout lies.
Is there a vivid memory that you still carry today from those early years in the NHS?
I guess a vivid kind of memory that I have from my very early years, which was pre-NHS, was when I was working as a care assistant in a kind of residential home for young people with very severe physical disabilities. So doing personal care. And, you know, it was an impossible task. Like, you had to get everybody up and ready by 8 a.m. to have their breakfast. And you were assigned so many people. So you might have in your head, okay, you've got an hour, you've got 3 people, you know, 20 minutes per person. But people don't work like that. So,
Yes.
You know, being in this situation where someone might need a bit longer that day. And I remember an occasion where, you know, supporting someone, you know, kind of halfway through something. Those are really vulnerable young people who also want to talk. You know, they don't want you to feel rushed. You know, you've got to have person-centered care.
That's the whole point of psychology, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And this is before I was, you know, trained as a psychologist. I was, you know, just out of uni. And then someone else needs you urgently. And so you've got this choice. Do you, like, leave this person waiting or this person waiting? And neither are good options. And any choice you make is a bad choice because the resource is not adequate. And that really has stuck with me, that sense of having to choose between 2 bad options.
Yes.
And then feeling like you're causing someone suffering.
It's like abandoning someone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the golden threads of your discourse are compassion, connection, and creativity.
Yeah.
How do you hold on to these when you have 60, 70 emails to answer every morning?
Yeah. It's not easy.
How is that done?
Well, I guess there's 2 points I would say. One is about how we might think about that as an individual, and then how we might think about that as a team or as a system.
Yeah, let's discuss both.
So I guess as an individual, again, you know, compassion, we define compassion. This is a definition from compassionate mind therapy as a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others and a commitment to alleviate that. So the first part of that is about sensitivity and about noticing and naming. And that sounds kind of simple and common sense, but actually it's often not done. Yeah. So, you know, when we are faced with 60, 70 emails, you know, and things are running late and it's all important, being able to notice and name that this is really hard, that this is impossible. That
most people would ignore it. I would ignore it.
What, ignore the emails?
Yeah, no, not ignore. Ignore the feeling that, oh my God, I have so little time and lots of things to do, but I just march on.
Yeah,
and I never name it.
Yeah,
which is not good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make it go away.
Pretend that it's not there, hoping that it's...
But neither does ignoring it. Doesn't make it go away either. So what you know, we often find is that what we want from the system, this, you know, people who are healthcare professionals are super resilient. They can take a lot. They can cope with a lot.
Can this be abused?
Oh yes. But what people start to really feel when that becomes uncomfortable is when it starts to feel really unfair.
When it crosses a line of, I'm doing a brilliant job, I have integrity, I have ethical, moral codes, to being in disadvantage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So when people feel like this isn't fair, or no one is noticing this, like no one is acknowledging how hard this is, because they'll just come with something else and pile it on. And often what people want really is acknowledgement and fairness. That goes a long way. But we're not good at doing that for ourselves either. So we know we want that from the system, but we're not good at offering that for ourselves either. So we're not good at saying to ourselves, God, this is really hard. Like, you know, this is you're doing an amazing job given the impossibility, or gosh, I can feel, you know, this is a hard day. You know, this is a moment of suffering here. And being fair about what else we take on or how we manage our lives, how we strike a balance for ourselves, we're not good at doing that.
No, we usually take way more workload and even family load than we could
So you'll
support.
find that GP is also, on the PTA committee or school governor meeting.
It takes a lot of time. People don't realise that.
Nightmare.
And
just the cognitive load, and will be key in managing all the family dynamics, and just by the nature of the things that led to being part of that profession. But that isn't fair on us always, on our own systems. So I think that's what compassion is about. That's where it starts, is the sensitivity to that suffering. And it's, that's a whole thing in and of itself. But what happens when we are not sensitive to it is it's very easy for our systems to become overwhelmed, overloaded. And how we cope with that is through disconnection. So we then are disconnecting from our colleagues, so from the system. We get cynical, we get hopeless.
Disconnecting emotionally.
Or shutting socially. Down emotions. Okay. Socially, we might withdraw. Doctors, have, higher than kind of normal or average, use of alcohol or drugs as a way of disconnecting, as a way of managing. Wow. We might start disconnecting from patients. That's often when people start to seek help, because that's this kind of moral position that feels wrong. When people start to notice that they don't care about their patients, or they're getting angry with patients. So
the first step, at least, is to acknowledge that. Do they have to report these feelings? Am I obligated to tell my boss if I struggle with burnout?
I know that, I suppose, from a psychologist point of view, that, part of the kind of requirements for HCPC registration is a commitment and responsibility to your own well-being. And I believe that's the same for doctors. So there is a responsibility to look after ourselves and make sure we are fit to practice. But there's also a reality to what is going to be most helpful in that. And it depends on your boss. Whether there is enough psychological safety there for that to be helpful. So, there is wisdom and discernment that's needed. But certainly, there are lots of places and spaces that are available for people to seek help. It's hard to do, and it's really hard for health professionals because it's so tied up with, ideas of weakness, and we're used to helping and fixing everyone else, and it's very unfamiliar to be attending to those needs in ourselves.
Their whole job, health professionals, is to assist others, look after others. But when it comes to self-compassion, the tap might run dry. As you mentioned, it might be seen as enabling laziness or weakness. But these are psychological barriers, right? They
are psychological barriers, but they can also be reinforced by the system. That's where the systemic kind of factors and what goes on around us really matters. So if you think about, a traumatic experience, and I do a lot of trauma therapy in my work, one of the things that's important is how an event can be a traumatic event, like a car crash, for example. In and of itself, it can be really traumatic, or an assault. But often what sticks with people and what causes kind of lasting harm is how other people responded to that event. So if you've been assaulted, for example, whether you were believed or not, whether you were shamed or not, would make that experience much, much worse, and very much impacts how you're able to process the trauma of the event.
And I guess the fear of consequences, if a doctor said to a manager that I find it difficult
Yeah.
these days. Maybe the manager is obligated legally to escalate or to offer help.
Yeah.
That
So how the system responds, and not necessarily to big, massive events, but to the small things, to the, the difficult consultation, or the mistake, or how safe you feel within that context really makes a difference to how traumatic or difficult distress sits with you. And if the system is not a compassionate one, if the message you get is suck it up, keep going, like we don't have time for this. We internalize that.
They truly don't have time. Maybe they don't have time. Yeah.
But there's ways of saying that.
Oh yeah, of course.
There? Yeah. It can be a both and. It can be, I'm so sorry you had to go through that.
Yes. It makes a whole difference.
It does. It does. So it's very difficult for us to be compassionate to ourselves, but that can then is, reinforced by the system too. So it's much more effortful if we want to do something different. It can be really hard.
Can compassion be learned?
Yes. So we understand compassion as a skill, that we can practice, that we can, that we have to practice, because it's often very unfamiliar to us.
Really?
Yeah.
As human beings?
Well, it's useful, I think, to make a distinction between, talk about three flows of compassion. So there's compassion from self to other, compassion from other to self, and from self to self.
Yes.
So healthcare professions are often, that the self to other
outwards
flow is very well practiced and is very default. But being able to receive compassion for other people might be quite scary. So it can feel really uncomfortable. It cannot feel good.
I relate, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like giving me the impression or the idea, I can't do it on my own. I'm weak.
Right.
And or I might be reliant on external support for longer than I'd like.
Yeah.
But it's perfectly fine to accept support and embrace it.
But it's also okay for that to be difficult, because that might be, related to early experiences, all the messages that you've grown up with. You may have had experiences of being vulnerable and dependent, and it being bad for you. So the self to other can be very difficult, and it can feel threatening. So we need to acknowledge that, to name it, to work with that. And similarly, self to self can be very foreign, very unfamiliar, very unknown. And threatening. People can often think, if I left myself off the hook, I'm going to get lazy. I won't be able to meet these standards for myself. I'm going to let things go, and then where will I be?
Yes.
So it's a lot of these things. I guess a lot of psychology is like simple but not easy.
Simple but not easy. It's a lovely way of describing
it.
it.
So it's, it's very simple to say be more compassionate to yourself, but it's really not easy.
When it comes to burnout, we usually use this word loosely to say, I had a tough week or something. But what is burnout? Clinically speaking, what exactly is burnout?
So interestingly, burnout is not like in the DSM or the ICD. It's not a diagnosis. You can't be technically diagnosed with burnout. But the sort of description that the World Health Organization uses, interestingly places it very much as an organizational phenomenon and about work demands not being appropriately managed.
Okay.
And it has these three components of emotional exhaustion, kind of self-doubt and a lack of self-efficacy.
Yes.
And then the third
because
one...
Because I can't manage things.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Oh,
So sort of not feeling that you can do it. You've lost the sense of efficacy and empowerment, which, can look like anxiety for some people. And then the third component is cynicism. and detachment.
I don't understand this one. I read, I think I heard you speaking about it. Cynicism, why?
So it's a cutting off.
Okay.
So, and you will, if you've, worked in the NHS, you will, have these experiences of, someone's, management are introducing a new change and everyone rolls their eyes like, oh, here we go again.
Because that necessarily entails more changes and things they need to do.
And if you don't have resource, but it's more often because people have lost faith and lost trust in the organisation, so they don't see it as helpful. They've lost trust. So this often happens with wellbeing initiatives, for example, that there'll be mindfulness, class that you can access, or an app that work is paying for or something. And on the one hand, we might be able to think, that, we know that's good. Like, if people can access mindfulness, it's really good for their mental health. If people can eat more fruit and veg or like go for a walk, whatever, we know that's good. But if it's coming from work, people are like, oh, the eye roll.
No, I get that. I get that.
And, so that's one way that burnout can present itself, which, that colleague who is like snappy and irritable and, like everything, grumpy all the time. And
this kind of cynicism, do people use these strategies as a coping mechanism?
Yeah, I think it's a cutting off. It's a defense against the gap between how you want things to be and how they are, and the exhaustion. It's absolutely exhausting to hold that chronically, to hold that gap. And so if you can, if you then hold a position of, I don't care, like, oh, here we go again, like all this is just nonsense, that feels better than...
In a way. It's true.
In a way. But the problem is we can't, burnout is chronic. It's not having a bad day. It's, ongoing for a long time. So if you're stuck in that very cynical place, it really impacts your life more broadly. Work loses its meaning, then you don't feel good about going to work, and you still got to go to work. So that's very draining. And it can start then showing up outside of work, in your relationships, in your ability to connect.
You once framed burnout as a state of psychological dysregulation. I think you called it threat drive cycle, revving us up. Please explain this cycle to us.
So this comes from, again, compassionate mind theory, which describes us as having three systems of emotion. So we've got the threat system, which is our fight or flight or freeze system. Something that we are all very familiar with. It's our default system. It's the one that's going to fight for survival, keep us alive, keep us going, really important. Then we have our drive system, which is about pursuing goals, about striving, about problem solving. It's our clever, thinking part. That's the part that does all the doing, all the fixing, which again, as healthcare professionals, is very familiar to us. We often really like that part. It's an energizing part. And what we often kind of get into is that our default mechanism for regulating threat, so when the threat system is activated, our go-to is drive. We're going to fix it. We're going to sort out that problem.
And that's a good thing.
It's a good thing up to a point. Okay. So it's very effective. If we can solve the problem, that's great. If you've got a sick patient in front of you and you know what's wrong and you can fix it, amazing.
Yeah, doctors are amazing troubleshooters.
Yeah, amazing, brilliant. The problem is that in two ways. One, oscillating between threat and drive all the time, if that's your only options, that's really exhausting. It's very draining. And you can only do that for so long before the kind of allostatic load, the stress impact, you start to feel that. So that's one problem. The other problem is that not all problems can be solved through drive. So thinking about grief, for example, or these kind of the moral injury, the kind of wicked problems that we see in complex health systems. How do we do all of this with not very much resource? We can't fix it.
Yeah, I can imagine a health professional feeling very helpless.
Right. Yes.
How can I fix this?
Yes.
And they are natural fixers.
Right. And so what happens then is you're just activating threat. You're not you can't regulate threat in that way. It just it builds. The threat is worse because you're helpless, can't fix the problem. So what we're neglecting there is the third system of emotion, which is our soothing system, and that's the rest and digest system. So that's the system that helps recovery, rest, and connection with other people.
Yes.
The kind of care and repair side of life. And it's not to say that, any of these systems is more important than the others, but we need all of them in balance to function well and to sustain functioning. And it's that soothing system that needs practice, that we're very poor at cultivating.
Yes.
And that's driven by our society, emphasis on productivity.
And the expectations, I think, from us patients to have 100% emotionally available doctors. And there is, I read somewhere that there is a culture of self-sacrifice in the NHS kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. It really is built on the idea of people going the extra mile. In the NHS trust I worked in, that is an interview question. Tell us about a time you went the extra mile. So at that point, the expectation is set, you will be going the extra mile, which is such an interesting idea.
Yeah, from the first second. Now, this is what you're expected to do.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And that's rewarded. But the cost is not counted, by the system. It's held by individuals. Burnout is a systemic problem, but the impact is very individual. It's felt by people, their families. It takes a huge toll.
Yeah. I remember now one of my professors, I was very young in my 20s, I was banging my head against the wall trying to solve something. He said to me, Hella, there are problems with no solutions. Keep going and deal with it, come to peace with it. But how would I tell doctor or no doctor that, how would I distinguish the difference between burnout and just being very tired?
Taking a break and having time to rest is really important. And if that, if having the weekend off, having a holiday, if you're able to actually switch off from work, really not, answering emails, etc. If that's enough, having a really proper good rest is enough to recharge and you can go back into work, then that's probably not burnout.
Yes, if I could recover within a relatively short period of time, I'm okay. Yeah.
And it's, that recovery is crucial because if you don't do it and you put it off, your risk for burnout increases. You've got to have rest regularly. That soothing system, if that doesn't get a chance to reset and recover. And what people also, I think, kind of don't always acknowledge is that the balance is really important. So doing this kind of role requires more rest, more.
So the more you do, the more rest you'll need.
Yes. Whereas people do the opposite.
Yes,
the more driven, the less is attended to rest.
So if I feel I have a proper burnout, do I need medical intervention, or should I deal with this using the techniques you mentioned, the rest and others of these?
If you are clinically burnt out, you won't have a choice because you won't be able to function. And so, you will need time off work.
Okay, what happens if I don't listen to my inner person and keep going and keep going?
Yeah, so your body will tell you. It will get really sick.
I've read once that that's the origin. I mean, I know it's not your specialty. Autoimmune diseases.
Yeah. I'm sure there's lots of factors to that, but absolutely, people sometimes it's that a real health scare, a real health shock that wakes them up, and sometimes it's things like people's hair falling out, eyebrows falling out all of a sudden, people having heart attacks, there's kind of really serious impacts. Most often, the people who come to me for therapy, this is a really common experience, that they'll know they're struggling, but they're keeping going. And then there's one morning that they'll drive to work and they can't get out the car. They are in floods of tears and they literally feel they cannot get out of the car and they have to call someone to help. They're like paralyzed. And there's nothing really has happened. Like there's no big crisis that's
probably
can help them make sense of it. But it's this kind of accumulation and then sort of falling off a cliff experience.
And they don't see that coming. I was just going to ask you about the early warning signs of burnout. Is there something that they are missing?
Yeah, they're ignoring. Yeah. So it's things like, not feeling like your normal rest breaks are enough, the weekend not being enough to recharge and go back.
I met a doctor here at GP who was telling me that there isn't enough time during work days to answer emails, so she does that during the weekend.
Right.
And she has 3 children and it's painful.
Yeah, it is. And other signs are about the kind of disconnection. So that might be cutting off from all the things that really bring you joy and meaning. So you're starting not to socialize, you're giving up your hobbies.
Because there isn't enough time.
There isn't enough time or energy.
Yeah.
So people might be in a state where they're not feeling like they're doing, they might be like Netflix is on and they're just zoning out quite a lot or on their phone scrolling. So life becomes much more empty. Because it's the emotional exhaustion. Part of it is physical, but that can usually be resolved with a holiday, a rest. Yes. But it's the emotional exhaustion that is much harder to resolve. And that's what leads to the cutting off, because everything else feels too much effort. It's hard. You don't want to go to the pub with your friends anymore because you're too emotionally tired. Or the playing, then you get irritable with your kids or, all of these constant things more than usual. And it's a difficulty to repair that. The repair becomes more difficult. So there's pressure on relationships. So you will see many areas of a person's life impacted, but this is with healthcare professionals because that's who I know best. They're prioritizing work over all of that. So still functioning, people at work might not notice. There's this high functioning burnout. Yeah, they're still going, they're still performing, maybe not as well as they could. Maybe they're snapping at colleagues. But that's the last thing they're going to let go of. Okay. They're going to let go of the hobbies, the friends, the other stuff first.
Mentioning colleagues now, is there a way that colleagues could support each other? First, what are the warning signs that they can spot in each other, and how they could acknowledge or say something when a colleague is struggling? What would you do, not as a psychologist, but as a colleague, without sounding bossy or intrusive?
Yeah, I guess it's two parts come to mind. One is about what we do just day to day and how we set up our environment to make that possible and to have lots of opportunities for the care and repair, for that soothing system to be online. So, it's really important to have spaces at work where people might bump into each other. And
is that usually the case in a hospital or a medical center?
Yeah, the kind of the break rooms, like where people are having tea and coffee, that kind of thing. Okay. Much, much harder with remote working. So that's one of the things that is a real downside of people working from home, that you don't just say, oh, hi, how are you doing? And then you're like, oh, that was, I've just come out of a really tough thing. And, just that co-regulation of nervous system is really important and really helpful. So having opportunities, really attending to team bonding just as part of built into the fabric of work is really important. So that's because really we want to prevent this, of course. It's much, much harder to pull people back than to prevent things from, the stress from building.
Yeah. And I guess that would ultimately require a safe environment, the culture itself, people supporting each other, not competing with each other.
Yeah. So attending to that, yeah.
Tell us the most dangerous misconception about workload that you've read about or seen on social media.
I guess what social media offers a lot, and I have a very ambivalent relationship with social media, so I try to not get into it too much, is the idea of kind of productivity hacks, how to get more, how to do more. Time management
and all the rest of these things.
The kind of, wake up at 5, like we all have so many, the same hours in the day, how come these people can get more done? And,
how can I jam more tasks, how do I manage? Wash your face and do the sink at the same time.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
This was so ridiculous when I read it. I was like, really?
Yeah. And that, you see how that reinforces that threat drive. That, it's kind of how do you get your drive system to work harder for longer? And if you're not doing that, there's something wrong with you. You're not good enough. You're not trying hard enough. Look, other people, can do it. What's wrong with you? That's such a common theme in the doctors that I work with. They look at everyone else and everyone else is coping and doing all the things, and what's wrong with me?
Maybe seemingly.
Exactly. Right? Yes, they're performing, they're presenting a certain way. We don't know what's going on for people.
Yeah, because that's what they are expected to look like or to behave. Yeah, they are doctors at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, do we women get more burnout than men?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I think what comes to mind there is this interesting idea that the WHO defines burnout as a workplace phenomenon. And I have an issue with that because I think women do much more unpaid, unrecognised work than men. We know that's true.
We look after the household, the school runs, all the children is buying this and that and looking after them. And we have a full-time job and we do everything.
Yeah, the domestic
labour.
Men
go to work and come from work.
Yes.
That's what they do. Yes. Not to underestimate the incredible things they do, of course. But
that
play
is
so
true.
Many roles.
Yeah, we know that studies that count up the hours of work, domestic work that women do compared to men shows a vast difference. And that increases when couples have children, that the difference increases. And it's a frustration for me that is the definition within the WHO, because it totally does not recognise work that is not paid. And that is a huge source of workload. If we just look at it from the perspective of how many hours are you spending attending to responsibilities.
Yeah, I can think of new mums as well. New mums, that's catastrophe.
Yeah, it's huge.
How much they, with so little sleep, how much they do.
Yeah.
And they're being told, what have you been doing the whole time? Kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh. And there's sort of nothing to show for it other than your baby's still alive, which is a big...
It's a miracle.
It's a big thing. But there's no kind of tangibility to that.
Yes.
That society rewards.
I thought once when I had... I have one child only. And when I was met with such remarks, I thought one day, okay, I'm going to wake up, write down, literally write down everything I do from the morning till my husband comes back.
Yeah.
I'm no longer married.
That's a lot.
For good reason. But I never got around to quickly write.
No.
That took time.
No.
I did this and did this. And it was such a ridiculous idea.
Yeah.
People should appreciate, each other's contributions. Was about obvious, of course, burnout for new moms, or especially before they go to school. That's a massive thing.
Or mums of children with special needs. It's because it's not just the the physical labor of doing all the things and all the time that takes. It's the cognitive and emotional load. It's the thinking. It's the scanning. The kind of predicting people's needs before they're there. All that kind of executive function load is massive.
I think this is one of the main functions for a mom with children under the age of 4. Protect them.
Yes.
Even if you're walking
peacefully
with your dog and the child needs protection, anything can go into their mouth. So always the senses are super sharp.
Yes.
Yes.
The threat drive is highly activated there, that you're scanning the horizon all the time for anything that could go wrong.
Yes. Yeah. You have a lovely blog, Should I Quit? It tackles that dreaded question. Staying can be courageous. You're looking after your family, putting bread on the table, but at the same time, it can be self-destructive. How would I know it's time to redesign work, negotiate with managers or managing colleagues versus I'm out of here. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'll quit.
Yeah. I think it's such a hard question because I think it depends on your options. It's easy to say if...
Let's say options are very tight. So otherwise, I wouldn't be in that soul-crushing job.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one because I think, firstly, that's worth exploring. Like, it's one thing if you're the main breadwinner, you're the breadwinner or your family relies on your income, and the risk of losing that is not... The system can't tolerate that. But it's a different question around, when the barriers are things like everywhere's like this, it's not going to be better anywhere else, or, I haven't done a job interview in so long, like no one will have me. At least I know what I'm
facing here.
Yeah, this is at least known, the risks might be too big elsewhere. So sometimes we shut down our options because of that kind of thinking, or I've worked, the sunken cost, I've put so much into this workplace. If I leave now, I'll have to start again somewhere else, or I owe it to this place to stay, or
fix it, or
I really care about this work. So that's just an important kind of examination. Like, are you shutting down your own options here. Just checking that out, because sometimes it can feel a trap that is almost like, an abusive relationship. Sometimes those,
Yes.
when you hear people saying, I can't leave because no one will have me, when it's good, it's really good.
Funny, that come to mind, the same professor, the same person, also once told me that there are always options, and it's up to me whether I'm ready to take the option or not. Yeah, he was very wise. He's still alive.
Yeah. And it's evaluating the cost of going with the cost of staying. So sometimes that's an important question. Like, we're dealing with uncertainty and risk. Make change is risky. We don't know. But maybe we can get a sense of what are the costs of staying. What might it be like if things don't change for you? What is that taking from you? So having that as an important perspective as well. There's a question about what can you change within your job? And it's really helpful to reflect on the 6 risk factors for burnout that, for example, the health and safety executive highlight. So they are workload, control, reward, belonging, values, and fairness. So if you kind of were to think about in your job how these different things stack up and what's changeable. So the one that people always think about when they think about burnout is workload, that there's too much work and not enough resource. And that can absolutely be true. So then there's thinking about, your own boundaries in managing that. There's thinking about delegation. There's thinking about escalation, being clear about how that fits. But it's also true that the other factors play a huge role, and sometimes those are more malleable or more important actually than workload, because I think we were talking about a little bit earlier that particularly health professionals can carry a lot, and it's not always the workload in itself that becomes the factors that tip them over. It's these other things. So if we think about control, for example, that's about having autonomy over how you do your job. So being able to choose, manage your own diary, for example, or, having control over other aspects of the work can make a huge difference to how the workload feels. And we know that when autonomy and control are taken away from people, when things are imposed on them, that really shifts how it feels. It really shifts the weight of the workload. We can also think about reward. So often, again, that immediately brings to mind money and pay, which is really important. If you don't feel like you're being paid fairly or properly, again, that everything weighs more heavily on you, and that's important. And, we need to address those kind of issues around, social justice in how we pay our workforce, really important. But again, there are other aspects of reward that can make a difference. So things like opportunities for learning, training, acknowledgement, gratitude,
appreciation.
Yeah, appreciation go a long way. And that's not to say that those things can compensate for being poorly paid, but when we're thinking about, what can we do in restricted systems, are there opportunities for, learning or experiences that feel very rewarding? That makes a huge difference. People want to be able to do their job well. They want to have new experiences. They want to learn, especially health professionals. Opportunity to do training feels very nurturing and nourishing, and the opportunity to put that into practice is very rewarding.
You have something called Burnout Toolkit. And you help people recognize their individual burnout pattern. Did I understand this correctly, that each one of us respond to burnout in a different way?
What I think is helpful about this toolkit is that, because we've talked a bit about burnout being identified with these three components, so the emotional exhaustion, the lack of self-efficacy, and cynicism. So in an individual's experience, one of those might be more prominent than another. And it's really helpful to be able to discern that, because that can help you think about what's going to help and what's going to make things better for you. There's a mixture there, but being able to examine that a little bit and be more specific about your experience can be really important in prevention and recovery. I have added these other two types of burnout because I think they're really pertinent for healthcare professionals particularly, which are trauma and moral injury. So sometimes people use the word burnout when they're actually talking about being traumatized, because there are overlaps there. If we think about emotional exhaustion, we think about withdrawal, we think about irritability, those kind of things can be related to trauma rather than burnout. And then also thinking about the moral injury and the moral distress that can be very, very wearing. So those aren't sort of technically forms of burnout, but within healthcare, it's really important, I think, to keep those in mind so that we can be specific about what we're talking about when people are trying to identify their needs and what needs to be different.
Yeah. And you also mentioned withdrawal as one of the responses. Some health professionals would disappear into busyness, just being busy, and others disappear into silence. They shut down to survive. Is that how it works?
Yes. So I think there's often a continuum between this kind of over-engagement and disengagement. So those are the one extreme ends. So some people will be drawn to over-engagement. So when that threat system is activated, they might be drawn to overworking, really feeling more responsible for people's problems, taking on more, really thinking and feeling and absorbing, the emotional distress and worry, and almost become fused with work, which is not helpful. On the other hand, and this is, there may be personality factors or other factors involved, people may cope by cutting off and becoming disengaged. So then we might see that cynicism, the not caring, or the use of, alcohol or drugs to really cut off. And neither of those are healthy positions. In order to do this job, we need to be engaged. We need to be able to, be compassionate and connected with our own experiences and others. But it needs to be boundaried and contained so that we're not overwhelmed by it. So
I remember, I think some of the doctors that you interviewed in your podcast were saying things like just going through the motions.
Yes.
The actions, but not feeling the connection between them and their patients.
Yeah, so being just on autopilot.
You've also said that the things that make us good at our jobs can also be the things that might make us vulnerable to burnout. Could you please elaborate on this paradox?
Yeah. So most people go into healthcare because they really care.
Yes, they want to help.
They want to help and hold strong values about relieving suffering for other people and about excellence. About, might often hold beliefs that, putting others' needs in front of their own, that can be a really explicit message that we can get as we grow up. And that makes for a good healthcare worker. If you're able to put your need for sleep aside so that you can do a night shift.
Oh, wow.
If you're really committed to providing excellent care,
Dedication,
the training is grueling, that can be brutal. You've got to be a really dedicated, conscientious person. The stakes are high. There can be life and death risks here, and so you want to be conscientious, very careful.
So all these wonderful traits of empathy and dedication, seemingly positive, could be a risk factor.
Oh yes, massive risk factor. If you think about perfectionism, we think about that going into anxiety, not being able to turn off, to kind of unhook from all of that, overworking.
How could health professionals reconcile with that? Is there a balance?
Yes. I think, again, it comes back to noticing and naming that. If you can be aware of it, if you can notice for yourself that is happening and that it costs you, this is kind of this fundamental existential issue about being human, is that the things that matter to us are the things that cause us pain.
Yes.
And we can...
it's such an unfortunate thing, but it's true.
It is, yeah. And we can not have the pain if we don't care about anything. So that's when you get to your detached, cynical side. Part of the process is about accepting that this hurts because you care. That gives us an opportunity to kind of diffuse a little bit. So it can be, if it's here, we can't see it, and we're just living it. But if we can get a little bit of space and name this and say, this is my perfectionism that is driven by my values for excellence, but it's costly. And if I'm totally buying into it, I can't see it, and I can't see and connect with anything else that's important in my life. It can become damaging and unhealthy for us.
I can tell that there might be things that would be within my control. My own responses is the boundaries that I set, if there's such thing in a workplace. But there are other things that are not within my control that I can't change. There are the organizational cultures, the shortage in resources. How should I focus psychologically on what's in my control and manage the other things so I can survive a very demanding job?
Yeah. So I think that's about striking this balance between, that healthy drive, which is about doing the things that you can do that doesn't cost too much, and also that soothing system that allows us to hold what we can't easily fix. And that is about community. It's about connection with other people. It's about the kind of repair aspect of nurturing what work might take from us in terms of making sure we are looking after our bodies, the other things that are really important to us. So sometimes it's about just, it makes a difference if something's happened to you that you can't change, that you can't fix. Like grief is often, a thing that comes to mind. We can't undo it, but it does make a difference if someone can be with you in that, and if you've got space for
Support.
it. If you're able to express that in whatever way, rather than, shutting it down or trying not to feel it. And that's the same with this stuff. If we can make space for it, if we can have community and connection around it, solidarity, it does make a difference. And it can also energize us to support change. So it's not that means we have to give up hope and just live with it, but we know that if we continue to just oscillate between threat and drive, we actually reduce our capacity for change.
Yeah. Tell us an evidence-based strategy that could help but doesn't get lots of attention.
I think an evidence-based strategy that is really helpful is around compassionate mind training. So that is about working on our compassion muscles.
Towards ourselves.
Towards ourselves, yeah. And it depends what, if we think about those 3 flows of compassion, where you might be struggling. If it might also be receiving compassion from other people, might need to be a piece of work. But there's lots of evidence and some really clear kind of psychological, strategies and programs around getting better at that, and using practices and intention. So, one of the things that we know really helps just to get that soothing system online is soothing rhythm breathing.
Soothing rhythm breathing.
So it's about sort of fostering the mind-body connection that we know is totally activated within our threat response. That's a very physical nervous system response.
How do I learn that?
There's lots of practices, so we can put some links there online.
Okay, absolutely.
And it's again simple but not easy. So it's about finding a rhythm of breathing in and out that activates, that regulates your threat system and enables the soothing system to come online. And that's often the first step, because we are our nervous systems. There isn't a separation between mind and body. And in order for us to step into a different cognitive or different emotional state, we need our bodies to be with us in that. So soothing rhythm breathing can be a really helpful kind of first step to help activate that. And then there are loads of practices. Kristin Neff is a key figure in the self-compassion literature. And again, she has loads of brilliant exercises on her website. But something, for example, like a self-compassion break, where kind of like a mindfulness type exercise, but it covers these 3 components of kind of the mindfulness and sensitivity. So taking that moment to notice, this is a moment of suffering for me. Acknowledging the common humanity in that I'm feeling like this because I'm a person. And when people, there's a gap between our values and our reality, that hurts. And this isn't me being broken. This is me being human. And then the third component, which is offering yourself kindness in that moment, which might be, and as I always do this when I start talking about it, a physical gesture, hands on heart, or a hug, or like you would offer someone you really cared about, you'd offer them a touch, is very co-regulating. And you might say some kind words like, I'm so sorry this is happening to you. And that can feel really weird to do, and effortful and unusual. But there is evidence that is something that we can practice and get better at, and that it does have an impact in helping us regulate our nervous systems, and then shift gear in how we are able to engage and relate to work.
One thing that struck me is how you talk about the cumulative exposure to suffering in a health professional's life. It's not one big trauma, it's the drip, drip, drip effect over years. Why is this invisible exposure dangerous?
I think that, we can't help things that we aren't aware of. So again, noticing and naming things that are unseen, things that are unacknowledged, don't go away. They just build up. It's a bit like, I'm sure everyone will have in their house a kitchen drawer or that cupboard under the stairs where you like push all the stuff,
throw away things.
You don't really know what's there, and it's kind of fine. It can be really fine and functional for a while, but there gets to a point where the drawer doesn't close anymore. Yes. Or you're tripping over things, and it starts to interfere with your life. And that's very similar with these experiences that we have, that if we're just pushing them away, if we're just stuffing them down, they don't go away. They're kind of waiting
there to bite us.
And it is, as you say, it's often not these kind of big traumatic experiences, although healthcare professionals are at risk of experiencing that kind of thing at work. But it is these little things that build up. And that's really important, actually, because often people will have that moment of, tipping into burnout or getting really distressed at work, and they don't understand why they reacted that way. Because what happened has happened 1,000 times before. Yeah. It's not a big deal. Why did that seems so out of proportion, and that can feel really frightening for the person, like they're going crazy or there's something really wrong with them. But actually, when you look at it, that's just the final straw.
Yeah, compound effect.
Yeah, the compounding effect. It makes sense.
Please tell us the psychological and physiological symptoms of vicarious trauma that doctors should watch out for in themselves.
Yeah. So vicarious trauma, we define that as a traumatization response associated with the being exposed to other people's distress. And it can be kind of linked with other ideas like compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. So there are some overlaps there, but often what people find, and burnout, there's overlaps, which is why it's useful to distinguish, because the experience can be one of being very drained, being cut off. Often key to it, though, is a change in how you relate to the world because of your experiences. So something that I know, is quite common on, like, we have a Facebook group for parents who are psychologists, and a common kind of question that comes up is people saying things like, oh, my child's been invited to a sleepover. I really don't like the idea of sleepovers because you've heard so many stories of children being abused in contexts like that. And like, can I sense check this? Like, is this vicarious trauma? Like, are my views being affected by all these stories that I've heard? Or am I right? Is this wisdom or is this vicarious trauma?
Yes.
So that's the kind of thing where you might be, your judgments about the world have shifted, that the world doesn't feel like a safe place anymore.
Is there anything hospitals and medical centres could do differently to safeguard health professionals from trauma?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to the acknowledgement of it and the kind of embedding in everyday workplace practices, acknowledgement that you are being exposed to suffering, and what is required for us as humans to process that suffering properly is kind of just access to our normal ways of that we do that as humans, which is by talking about it if we want to. It's about in nervous system regulation. So that's like walking, sleeping, access to nature, creativity, those kind of things. Community, team bonding. So team relationships are so key to that. So I think attending to those kind of systemic factors in an everyday way is the foundation. And then obviously there's also the practices that can support something when something has happened, that maybe that's not enough. So then we might be talking about huddles or debriefs or those kind of things that are that organizations might put in place for people, like as a first aid type response, and then also being able to access higher level interventions, psychological interventions, if that's needed, and making that part of practice, that we recognize that this is risky, psychologically risky work. So if you were, working in a chemical factory, you'd have your PPE, your protective gear, and you'd have processes to make sure that you're not contaminated when you go home. And that's part of the recognition of this is the work. In order to do this work, these are the practices that will keep you safe. In order to drive lorries around the world, there are very strict time limits, to do a plane, etc. And healthcare is the psychological risks are not recognized in that way in healthcare.
What are the consequences then? What happens in the medical setting when vicarious trauma gets unrecognized and unsupported?
Well, I guess we see mental health problems. Dealing with that takes huge cognitive load, so we can see more mistakes. We see interpersonal conflict. We see sickness, and we see people leaving.
Your conversation with Dr. Rachel Gibbons about surviving patient suicide was incredibly moving. What can you tell us about guilt and grief after these events?
Yeah, I think that was a really important conversation, and she's done great work as well since then, and there's some really useful guidelines out there from the Royal College of Psychiatry that I think are really valuable that she's written. I think a key message for me from those conversations has been understanding how, as humans, we do not like uncertainty, and our brains are much more comfortable with an answer, even if it means we feel guilty about something.
Why? Because this assumes that there is risk in uncertainty?
Yeah, I think our brains just don't like not knowing. So we are going to go for an answer to a question, even if the answer is it's your fault. Because if it's your fault, you can do something better. You can fix it. You can prevent it next time. You have some control. Okay. Whereas not knowing, not being able to understand is a helpless position to be in. And that's worse. Helplessness is worse than it's my fault. So what happens when there's a suicide is that immediately that we don't understand, that we didn't expect. And suicide is always very difficult to understand. And we can't ever find the answer from someone who's completed suicide of why they did it.
Would a psychologist feel partly responsible?
Oh, yes, hugely. And there's layers to that. There's the, horror of it. And what did I miss? And, what could have done differently? And the guilt, which in a weird way is easier than we can't predict this, we can't understand it, because that makes it much closer to home. Then it could be your most precious person in the world. It could be you in that position. Much more terrifying than this is an understandable thing. It could be prevented if only I'd done the right thing. And in healthcare, there's an added layer of, I'm going to get into trouble for this. There's risk here for me. I could lose my job. I could be struck off if this is my fault.
Because I'm assuming that someone's job is to investigate. Why did this happen?
Yeah.
Did this patient spoke to someone? Yes, they spoke to the psychologist. So
Yeah. What was the risk assessment? What's in the notes? What did they do? And the system itself is the same. The system can't handle uncertainty. The system will find an answer. You know, we've got lots of places have this idea of zero tolerance of suicide. I don't really know what that means, but it's the idea, it gives the message that suicide is preventable, that all suicides are preventable. And if it wasn't prevented, someone did something wrong. Someone missed something.
Can we predict the future? That's an important question. Could this create some moral wounds for a psychologist or health professional?
If someone kills themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because often it happens in situations where the resource is not adequate. You know, someone's been discharged too early, or, you know, people are so stressed that they maybe did miss something. And it certainly wasn't an intention, of course, for that to be the outcome. But sometimes people are in positions where care is inadequate.
What would have happened if I spent more time with that patient? Yeah.
And the ripple effects of that are huge, because you can see exactly next time that person is going to be either overworking to prevent that, or disengaging and not being able to care, not being able to get involved, which both of those are bad for the healthcare professional, but not also safe for patients and clients.
Yeah. Impossible choices.
Yeah.
I mean, during COVID, health professionals, doctors and nurses, they had to make impossible choices. Who gets the ventilator? Would I allow the family to visit the deceased, or not the deceased, the patient, person who's about to die? And these, could create these moral wounds that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. What does healing from moral injury require? Is it possible to fully recover, or is it something for a doctor to carry around and just manage or live with?
I suppose just like with any wound, it requires a noticing.
Yes. That's
the
first step, I guess, to acknowledge that something is
and
different.
naming it. And again, simple but not easy, but that process of being able to say, this is painful because it feels wrong, and I'm faced with impossible choices, and I'm part of this system, and it's messy and painful. And also I share that with others, that this is a community. You know, when we think about, you know, this is a shared trauma. And when you think about, you know, other shared traumas like war or earthquakes or whatever, it is about connection, and it's about community with other people. Not in part, there's that kind of, that's what we need as people to heal. But also that's what can drive change. You know, if we all are suffering in our own individual ways, change won't happen.
You also interviewed doctors about gender bias in medicine during COVID. How does gender affect or touch on all these subjects that we talked about, trauma, burnout?
There's a few ways. I suppose one of the issues to think about is intersectionality. You know, one of the things that we talk about in all of this.
Tell us what you mean by intersectionality.
So intersectionality is about holding kind of multiple identities, and particularly thinking about multiple minoritized identities and the cumulative impact when people hold more than one. So,
such as, give us examples,
so for example, being a Black woman holds a
woman.
very different, you know, set of life experiences, of cultural pressures than being a white man in our society. And it's a cumulative. So the difference, you know, being a white woman is again a very different experience from being a Black woman, a Black older woman, a Black older disabled gay woman. You know, multiple minoritized identities have a cumulative impact in terms of experiences of prejudice, experience of systemic inequality. And that takes resource to navigate, to survive, to fight, that isn't equally shared
would that
across the population.
Influence vulnerability to burnout in any way?
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about, their burdens that they're carrying and the resource they have to carry that, the heavier that is, the less resource you have for thriving. And we know that, NHS staff, people of colour who work in the NHS, experience racism frequently in their jobs. We know that women are often, women doctors are often referred to as nurses or,
I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not true. That's all.
Right. But it's not this experience of males.
Oh, well, of course.
So
neurodivergence as well.
Neurodivergence, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You talk about something called EMDR. What is that? How can we use it?
So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So it is a psychological therapy that was originally designed to work with post-traumatic stress disorder, but has much broader application. And it is predicated on the idea that traumatic memories are stored in the brain in a way that keeps them stuck. So a memory that has a lot of emotional heat attached to it is stored differently to
I want you to explain this in full. Talk to me like I'm a child, please. I want to understand this.
So if you, for example, if I asked you what you had for breakfast yesterday, you might remember because it might be the same thing you have every day. Yeah. But it kind of holds a different space in your mind, in your brain.
Less energy, maybe.
Less energy. You can talk about it.
Less care.
You can tell me it was Weetabix, whatever, and it's
no
fine.
one cares, right?
You don't. It's not activating. Whereas if you were to tell me about, the worst day of your life, you would feel differently about that memory. So it's.
What is the difference? Yes, sorry, you're going to answer. What is the difference between this memory and this memory in my brain?
Is that it has neural connections to the emotional centers of your brain in a way that
memory.
Yeah, in a way that the what you had for breakfast, the neutral memory doesn't have. Very traumatic memories, so things that have been really shattering to your sense of the world or self, what we find is they kind of get stuck in the brain. So even difficult things over time the brain will file away in a that was bad, but I'm over it type
file it
way.
Away. That's a good. Yeah.
It will. You will know that that's a past experience. So you might think about things like, your first pet that died or your first heartbreak or something, devastating at the time. But right now, most people would be able to think about that and it's fine. You could talk about it.
Over it.
You're over it. You know it's something past. It's over there. You could look at it, think about it, talk about it. Whereas a trauma memory, if it was activated, feels like it's now.
Yes.
And you might be feel it in your body. It might be intrusively coming into your mind. So it's stuck in your brain as present moment. It hasn't been filed away.
Is that something psychologically or physiological?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's how my brain is wired, how it functioned, how it reacted to that specific memory.
Yeah.
And what does this lovely EMDR would do to help me?
So EMDR is simulating your brain's natural process. So with something difficult that happens over time, your brain is naturally processing it. And a lot of that happens in REM sleep. So REM sleep is really important for helping us process memories and kind of take the heat out of that. So we know when that's disrupted, for example, in mental health conditions, it's a really suffering experience. And what happens in REM sleep is rapid eye movement. So your eyeballs moving from left to right. So what we understand is that is stimulating the brain left, right, one after the other, rapidly, and that is helping build the connections between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, and somehow that enables us to process and kind of file away these memories.
To shake the memory out?
An analogy that I find really helpful is to think about sea glass. So if you have a bottle, like a beer bottle or something, and it's broken, it's shattered, and into lots of really sharp pieces. If you were to hold that, if you're given a piece of glass, it would cut you. It's very sharp. So it's painful to carry that around. If we give it to the sea, and over time, the waves are washing over it, over time you will find that the edges have softened. You can hold it and it no longer hurts you. It's still there. It hasn't disappeared. It still has weight, but you can hold it without it hurting you.
How does that happen? Is this a talking therapy?
No. So what happens in EMDR is that we simulate that process, usually through rapid eye movement. So this is the processing part. There's 8 phases, but the kind of key processing part is where you activate the memory and the person by thinking about it, by noticing it, the images, the feelings that it creates, etc. So it becomes live for you. And you've done a process to find a target memory that's going to be key.
The most painful?
Yes, or the one that's most linked to the beliefs that like the wounds that it's left you with. So again, sometimes that's the event, sometimes that's how other people responded to the event.
Yes.
So we activate the memory and then we introduce what's called bilateral stimulation. So that is the moving of the eyes from left to right rapidly. So that's either following the therapist's fingers or a light bar, or we can do it on a computer screen. It can also
during the psychology session.
Yes.
Okay.
So it can also be tapping or noises in your ears. So there's lots of ways of activating that bilateral stimulation. And what we understand is happening in that process is that while the therapist is kind of facilitating the person to have dual attention, so part of them is holding the memory and part of their body, their nervous system is taken up with this bilateral stimulation. It allows 2 things to happen. One is that they can be with the memory and not be overwhelmed with it, because the working memory is taken up with the sensory stimulation. So that's like exposure, like you can be with this memory and it's okay.
It's not that painful anymore.
And it's not that painful. And it activates the adaptive information processing network by doing this bilateral stimulation, so that your brain gets to form the links between this memory and the rest of your life, the rest of the knowledge that you have about yourself, so that it's not stuck anymore. So people will start to, reduce the heat and the emotional intensity of the memory, but also loosen the grip that it has on them, will loosen the sense of moral meaning that a memory has left. So often that might be, I'm not good enough, or I don't matter, or I'm helpless. Some of those really common themes, or it was my fault, for example. And then when we're able to process it, we can put that in context and we can see, well, it wasn't all your fault. There were other things going on. This wasn't your intention. for example. And that's not the therapist saying that, because that's what happens in talk therapy, or, that's the person's own workings doing that. So it's much more powerful in that way, because it's the person experiencing that for themselves at the same time as their body, their nervous system is becoming regulated in the presence of this memory.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that the nervous system or my brain will be in a different state after going through this therapy.
Yeah, so it's not like hypnosis or something like that. You're always in control. The patient can stop at any point, but it does. People find it can be a really transformative experience, because it can really change the relationship to the memory in a way that can be much harder to get to with talking.
All right, interesting. In your conversation with another doctor in your lovely podcast, you discuss how people with ADHD are particularly vulnerable to burnout. I want to know from you, what is it about ADHD traits that might be a risk factor?
Yeah, so ADHD can create risk factors for burnout in a multiple ways. So one is often neurodivergent people are less sensitive to their internal signals. So they have poorer interoception. So they are less attuned to the subtle changes in their bodies, which means that they won't notice stress until it's further down the line. The other risk factor can be related to hyperfocus, which is often an experience that people with ADHD have. Hyperfocus, yeah. So the core issue with ADHD is not necessarily a deficit in attention, which is what the name suggests. It's really about regulating attention. So people with ADHD will struggle to focus on things they find boring, for example. But if that's something they're interested in, they can absolutely focus and concentrate, to the point of overworking, of not stopping for rest. People will talk about how they can, get into something and do it for hours and forget to eat. So again, that's a stress load on the body. The other part is the issues with doing boring tasks. So people will get into procrastination, avoidance of tasks. And there's a lot, and when we think about healthcare, there's a lot of boring things that have to happen. All the administration, all the emails, all of these things. So people with ADHD can really, really struggle to motivate to do those sorts of things, avoid them, which can build up and cause stress, because then people are not meeting deadlines. And that can be a chronic experience. It's a bit like a boom and bust. They can be really hyper-focused on something which is very draining, or leaving things to the last minute, which is really stressful. And a final kind of risk factor is related to compensation and masking strategies. So again, I work with a lot of women, health professionals with ADHD, who are only getting diagnosed much later in life and have obviously, led successful lives. But the cost of the sort of compensatory strategies that they've employed in order to do that is not seen by other people.
What are examples of this compensation?
So, for example, they might meet a deadline, so it's fine and it's really good work, but they didn't sleep for 3 days because they left it to the last minute, and then felt also really bad about themselves. So shame is often a very common experience, this sense of not meeting society's expectations, not doing things in the way that other people expect or want them to do. And also because people are often very aware that they may have a tendency to forget things, to be late, to be distractible, to procrastinate. Often particularly when it comes to work, will put lots and lots of systems in place to try and avoid that. So, for example, writing a report, they, might, read it over and over to check that it's right, or get to work at 7 a.m. because they know that's the only time that they could be able to concentrate on emails, because once everyone else has arrived, they won't be able to do that. But all of that adds up to a huge load that is at risk of burning people out.
You interviewed 3 clinicians about being diagnosed with ADHD as adults. What surprised you most about their stories?
I guess what surprised me most was, I suppose, in part thinking about people who are very, again, on the surface, hugely successful, but hearing what that has been like for them behind the scenes.
They look amazing. They function. They are doctors.
Yeah. I also think what is, I don't know if surprising, but maybe important, is how helpful it was to receive a diagnosis, even in the context of, being in their 30s, 40s, achieving their lots of goals, but still being able to name their experience and have a framework for that was incredibly de-shaming. I think that is the key.
Why? Because it explained other things that they experienced in the past.
Yeah. So often people will internalize messages of, I didn't do it well because, I don't care enough. I'm lazy. And that's just the opposite of reality. Often people are working much harder and, really care in order to meet those expectations. And also often people just having a way of understanding things like emotional regulation, things like motivation being differently wired to neurotypical people, knowing that there are other people who share those systems and ways of being, and that, you can, it's not all bad, that there's lots to celebrate there.
You mentioned being diagnosed later in life. Let's say I got a diagnosis that I have ADHD, whether I'm a health professional or not. Should I do anything about it, or should I just think, okay, I'm out of school, I have a family now, I have a job, I do half decently well, let's leave it?
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends. I mean, most people seek a diagnosis at that point because something's not working very well and something's hard. I think, some of the advantages, like from a practical point of view, apart from self-understanding, which I think is huge, and this kind of de-shaming, because people have often had frequent experiences of failure. And that often, really formative experience ages, so holding that sense of shame, which we know is linked to rejection sensitivity, which causes huge pain, there's a lot of suffering. So self-understanding and self-compassion and being able to, be kind to ourselves, I think is always helpful. I guess medication is an option that can really make a difference to people. Not everyone experiences that, but some people find it life-changing. And I guess, working with doctors, people, use it and experience it in different ways. Some people will find that it really helps to regulate on a shift, for example. Regulate attention, regulate, the ability to concentrate, to filter out, to sort of reduce the overwhelm.
Like it calms the nervous system.
Yeah. The other thing is about access to reasonable adjustments in work. So being able to have conversations with your employer. ADHD is classed as a disability. So there are opportunities that you can access through that. Access to work is a really great example where people with a diagnosis of ADHD are able to access funding for equipment or coaching, for example, that could really support people in the workplace. For doctors in training, support around exams that can be really important, really helpful.
There has been a surge in adult diagnoses recently. What's driving this?
Yeah.
Are we becoming more aware of ADHD?
Yeah, I think there are a few drivers. I think COVID was an important factor in this. I think that disruption of structure and systems had kind of went both ways for some people. That the loss of all of that for some people was very liberating, and people were able to realize that actually not having the stress of commuting or working in busy open offices suddenly.
We basically stopped doing lots and lots of things.
Yeah. And for some people, that was a revelation. They were like, wow, like I can think now because I can, just be in my own space. I can regulate stimuli. I'm not exhausted by the commute. For other people, the loss of structure and routine and having to rely much more on self-motivation was a disaster, and realizing actually...
What's going to keep me busy?
Yeah.
I don't have anything to do.
There's nowhere I have to be, or I can just be in my pajamas all day. And that really derailed some people. Obviously for healthcare professionals who were still having to work, those extra pressures. And for women, particularly if you had to homeschool your child or you didn't have childcare, just that, you might have been managing before, and then this absolute upheaval was, not possible anymore. So I think that was a key driver. Obviously, we've got social media as well, which has been, for good and ill, people have more access to information, not all of which is very accurate or helpful. But what we do know, I think what's really important is to distinguish between incidence and prevalence here. So while we know that the incidence of diagnosis has absolutely massively increased, the prevalence has not changed. So there are still the same number of people in the population who have ADHD, but they know about it more now than they did before. And we understand that it is still underdiagnosed. So even though there's been this rapid increase, which services have really struggled to keep up with, hence long waiting list, etc., it remains underdiagnosed.
So there has been a confusion about who can diagnose ADHD. Some saying that only psychiatrists are able to do it. What's your take on this?
So the NICE guidelines do not specify a specific profession who can diagnose ADHD. So it is open. You just have to have the right kind of experience. So it can be a nurse, it can be a pharmacist, it can be a psychologist, it can be a psychiatrist. The key things are about having, the right level of experience, both in neurodivergence, in clinical assessment, but also in mental health. So that's a really important point, because the kind of difficulties that show up in ADHD are also present in lots of other mental health conditions. So it's really a clinical judgment that's about, is there anything else that could explain this better, is a key question within the diagnostic criteria. So you have to know what anxiety, depression, PTSD, bipolar looks like in order to discern that.
Yeah. I can imagine that healthcare work can be extremely demanding for those with ADHD. The sensory overload and the constant interruptions, maybe the admin work, as you've mentioned before. Yet I've read that those with ADHD are particularly drawn to these intense roles.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, obviously everyone's experience is different, but for sure, there are some strengths within an ADHD profile that really fit with certain types of healthcare work. So, for example, the novelty and variety is hugely rewarding to people with ADHD, and that is inherent in healthcare.
Yeah, no minute is ever the same.
Exactly.
As
it's not a boring job. The intensity is another factor, but you know, people really do experience this differently. So I know doctors, for example, with ADHD who absolutely thrive in an A&E type environment. The intensity, that change, the novelty is very activating for them, very rewarding, and that's like a great environment. Whereas other people absolutely struggle with that because of the sensory overload and actually finding it really difficult to do that switching. So, for example, there are GPs I've worked with who have found that to be most helpful because the system supports the organization. You know, if someone else is giving you 15, 10-minute appointments, that structure can be very supportive. Often it's the kind of administrative burden of the job that is very taxing for people.
Yeah. How about emotional dysregulation? It's a core element of ADHD. How does that affect work?
Yeah, it's not a part of the diagnostic criteria, but it's a common experience within ADHD. And I guess what we see most often is that in the effort that goes into that emotional regulation that's required from professionalism can really take its toll outside of work. So often people are absolutely exhausted when they go home, or they may people have develop lots of ways of coping with this before they get a diagnosis. So people will maybe have hobbies outside of work that really assist that. So they might, be into like really extreme kind of sports or, lots of movement and activity, lead very active lives that support that regulation.
What about adjustments in the workplace itself? Things that could make a big difference with the ADHD, even if the workplace has zero budget.
Yeah. So I guess it's often things like, again, individual, but thinking about what might support the admin work. So could people do that from home, for example, if being in the workplace and having too many distractions is not possible? Or, is there a separate quiet space that might be available for them?
Would reminders help?
Yeah,
like
so sometimes
tools?
Just having regular check-ins with someone, because that accountability, that structure, breaking deadlines down can be really helpful. So that requires a kind of trusting, supportive relationship with people. So it's often not helpful for people to be working in isolation a lot. So again, while working from home can support, reduce distractions, it then puts more pressure on people to self-regulate and self-motivate, which can be very hard. So striking that balance between structure and flexibility.
But I could definitely see a gap between what the NHS promises when you're a junior doctor or when you're in medical school and what they can deliver in action itself. This is a very interesting topic. I mean, a doctor with great integrity will always do their very, very best, but as we said, often at the expense of their own health. Now, you talk also about avoidable harm. I'm assuming that harm done or inflicted on health professionals?
Yeah, so that has come up in the context of disciplinary investigations and complaints. So that we can think about avoidable harm when it comes to patient care has been, a movement and a big piece of work in terms of thinking about, what can be done to, prevent harm that is avoidable. So it's kind of taking that and thinking about relating that to the harm that is unintentionally done to health professionals when they face disciplinary investigations or grievances. So that's come out of, again, an awareness and a growing awareness of the harm that can cause. So people who have a complaint made against them experience huge suffering, and there can be great mental health consequences in relation to that. Part of that is obviously because it's a horrible experience. It's if it's threatening your livelihood, people are generally obviously very diligent and caring, and then to be accused of doing something that means you've missed that mark is very painful. But the processes around how these things happen, how they are investigated, creates additional harm. So often it's things like very poor communication. People don't know what's happening. They take a long time. People are left in limbo for ages. Often things like people becoming very isolated. They might be, if it's something that's happened within the team, taken out of that team, told not to talk to anyone. So they're losing their social support network. Also, they're often not being great options for teams between these extreme kind of suspending someone and having this lengthy investigation or doing nothing. Whereas actually there could be steps in between to address things more effectively and with less harm. But often managers feel like it's just one or the other.
Let's change gear a little bit to something bright and nice. We talked off air a little bit about knitting. Mm-hmm. You speak beautifully about creativity as a way to recover and heal from stress and burnout. What happens in my brain when I do these repetitive actions or movements, if I'm drawing, knitting, or what happens in my brain?
I work with a colleague, Mia Hobbs, who's also a clinical psychologist, in an organisational called Creative Restoration, and that the aim of that is to promote the mental health benefits of knitting in particular. And I think, to answer your question, we conceptualise the benefits of knitting and how that relates to how our brains and bodies work in three ways. So the first is about down regulation. So again, we're talking about the nervous system and how we can activate the soothing system through knitting. And that is part of how knitting can activate the relaxation response in these kind of soothing, repetitive motion. And that really mimics how we as humans are soothed. If we think about how we soothe babies.
Yeah, repetitive movements.
Repetitive movements. Okay. That's how babies experience, I think, I haven't asked any, but, being in the womb, the kind of, why that feels so cozy. We know, if you're on a car journey or a train, that. So knitting is a repetitive kind of movement that can activate that relaxation response. It's also very closely linked to a kind of mindful and meditative state. So the knitting itself can provide an anchor for our attention to help keep us grounded and calm the mind in the way that meditation and mindfulness
and the focus as well.
Yeah, exactly. So having that anchor physically and mentally helps to settle the mind.
Can it act as a reset button kind of thing?
Yeah, it can do, absolutely. That kind of a pause, because you can't rush around.
Yeah, you're going to miss the same time, right?
Yeah, there's an element of needing to concentrate, which, is, again, very soothing.
You're an avid knitter, aren't you?
Yes. Yes.
What is the last thing you knitted?
I have lots of things on the go all the time.
So many projects, lots of jumpers and socks.
And that's really important actually, because of, the many different ways that knitting can support us depends on the project and on the stage of the project. So, that kind of soothing, repetitive motion is only true when you've got an easy section of knitting. If you're just doing like garter stitch or stocking stitch, which is, just knitting or purling every row, I can do that without looking. I don't need to look at that, which means that it is an autopilot thing. So it's very soothing for me. But it leaves my mind open for other things. So I can do that while I'm watching TV, but I could also do that while I'm worrying. So if I'm wanting to take my mind off something, I would pick up a project that's more complex, that I need to be reading the pattern, I need to be really concentrating on it. And then I can't be ruminating at the same time. So it's really important to have multiple projects on the go.
And pick one depending on the state
on
of
your
mind.
needs. Yeah,
wow.
Absolutely.
So did I understand this correctly? The predictable rhythm of knitting disrupts my brain's tendency to worry, overthink, ruminate?
No, I think that if it's effortful knitting, then that disrupts the rumination. If it's easy knitting, it can make space for your mind. So sometimes that's what I need. So I tend to use knitting quite a lot as a post-work kind of ritual. If I'm full of people's stories and all that kind of complex thinking, I actually need time to digest before I move into the next part of my day, of my life. And so I actually want to sit with it, what's in my head. I want to process it. I don't want to rush off into something else. I want to make space for it, to filter it, to percolate. And that's when easy knitting is good, because that's when the repetitive rhythm, I don't have to think about the knitting. I can make space for being what's there for me. But if I'm getting hooked and stuck and worried about something or stressed about something that's taking up too much of my mind, a complicated knitting project can help me unhook from that, because I can't think about the worry and the lace pattern without making mistakes at the same time.
I get it, yeah. Amazing. But no, not everyone knits.
No.
What about gardening, walking, anything repetitive that could be physical? Would that help too?
Yeah, absolutely. So that can help with parts of it. So, if your aim is that kind of, it's like I know we mentioned before about that soothing rhythm breathing. That's it. It's kind of finding a soothing rhythm that helps your nervous system to down-regulate. And that will be different for different people. But movement, that repetitive movement is really helpful. Colouring, any kind of...
Colouring is a thing.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that, unfortunately, I'm ashamed to say that, but I don't think I'm a creative person at all.
Okay,
but, I do remember when Olivia, my child, was a toddler, and I would colour with her. That was very, very soothing. I loved it, but beyond that...
I think it depends how you conceptualize creativity. I think it's an innate human experience. I think if you think about... animals who have, been very clever and figured out how to use tools, for example, or they make a nest or a home, like they've figured it out and they've done it the same way for millions of years. A bird's nest, you can have a species has a particular way of doing a nest, but that's the way they do it. Whereas humans, we figured out how to provide ourselves shelter millions of years ago, how to cook an egg or make bread, but we are still inventing new ways of doing that. Every culture has a different way of making its home, of making bread, of cooking eggs, and we're we haven't just ticked that off because we solved the problem. So creativity is about self-expression and about novelty, making something new. So that shows up in all sorts of ways. It's not just art and craft. So I would challenge you on that.
Oh, Thank you. You've written that creativity helps us reclaim our humanity in dehumanizing systems.
Yeah.
Were you talking about the NHS?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that, can get shut out in the NHS and any kind of complex system is self-expression. Everyone has to do things a certain way, follow protocols, do things. There's pressure, and pressure kills creativity. Stress makes it hard to be creative. And that's, that may be in lots of ways very appropriate for that system, but it takes its toll on us. And we feel that, I think, if we are stifled from creativity, whether that is arts and crafts type thing, or whether that's learning, connecting with the world in new ways, when that's taken away, we suffer. So I think there's two messages, like, how do we offer a more humane environment within the NHS? And there's always, there's loads of beautiful work that happens around bringing art into hospitals, for example. And, lots of evidence that shows that just being around art is good for us. It lowers our blood pressure, it reduces stress, it brings people together. Music, yeah, absolutely. Things that, don't necessarily need to be expensive. But also how you might be able to use creativity in terms of work recovery, like how you can build that into your life outside of work as an antidote and a balance for what might be taken away in these systems.
It's funny, the NHS, because when I think of doctors, nurses, clinicians, it's all that knowledge and expertise and practice is all based on science. And to me, the way I see it, science is the epitome of creativity, thinking out of the box, troubleshooting, problem solving, coming up with new ways to discover other things. That's the way I see it. But the structure of how the NHS is set up and practices, that's a different matter, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do. It is really interesting to notice how many doctors, health professionals do have a really rich creative side. So there are some, huge kind of community of knitting doctors, knitting and stitching doctors. There's a lovely Facebook group called Pins and Needles.
That's clever.
So, that absolutely, it is something that, I do think is an innate human thing. But, and healthcare is an art too, as well as a science. We might like to pretend we have all the answers, but there's complexity and individuality there that is, and the connection that is so important as well.
So many doctors who would enter the NHS, they enter it, as you describe it, full of hope, but after a few years, they end up in a less positive place. What would have helped you when you started working in the NHS? What would have shifted the needle?
I mean, I think for me, what became difficult to stay was the sense of stifling and the sense of not being able to kind of grow as a person, as a professional, and it just feeling like it was no longer a good fit because I craved growth and creativity. So I think, and I think for many people who healthcare professionals who do leave the NHS, me included, it's a really painful decision. It is really, really hard to do that because you believe in the NHS, you care about it, your values are aligned on paper. You feel like it's, a moral failing to leave the NHS. But so I often think it's not a choice that people want to make. It's a choice that people make because that's how they're going to survive. So there's huge commitment to staying, and it probably wouldn't take very much to keep people sometimes. So I think, again, it's that just humanizing the workplace that doesn't need to take millions, but does require attention and sensitivity. And that can be, around just opportunities for connection with colleagues is so important, opportunities for learning, and acknowledging the realities.
Yes, yeah. Your podcast, When Work Hurts, you share in this podcast very poignant, powerful stories about how work hurts health professionals. How do you decide what's safe to share and what needs protecting?
Well, I think it's the process of working. I do a lot of work with the guest before we record. So talking that through with someone. I think an analogy that I find quite helpful is making a distinction between whether an experience feels like a scar or an open wound still, something that is still healing, as opposed to, it's left its mark, but it's kind of healed over, and would invite people to, not share things that still feel very raw to them. Have
you seen that? I mean, before episodes, have you seen wounds that are totally open now and you thought maybe we shouldn't be discussing that?
I think probably not so much, because I think probably the people I'm speaking to, doctors and psychologists, are very used to compartmentalizing and not opening things up. So I think they're probably quite practiced with that. But I do think carefully with people, and I think, there's always an opportunity to check in afterwards. If people have said, oh, I actually wish I hadn't said that, can we take it out? That's absolutely their, prerogative. So I think psychological safety in the process is really important, that people feel that they have ownership of what's shared. And
did you ever feel slightly guilty about criticizing the NHS? Because I think the core element of what you do might imply that. I mean, whether it's a negative or positive criticism, did you feel bad about it? Have you ever felt that?
I think, my feeling is that it's a bit like when someone insults your family. Like, you might, spend all day complaining about your family.
Yes.
But if someone else were to say that, that's not okay. So I still feel very the sense of great loyalty to the NHS, and my intention is not to criticize it, but to kind of attune into the realities and to notice and name those things, because without that we can't make change. And also, the NHS isn't one thing, it's not one person, it's this huge complex system. So I don't know that I feel guilty or bad. I think I'm aware of these kind of, tensions within myself around, feeling on the one hand very loyal to the NHS, and on the other hand, there is a reality that it hurts people to work in a system like that. And we want it to be better. We want it to be thriving. We want it to be, living its best life, because we need it. I need it. My children need it. My family needs it. I need the staff to be their best for me. But I also really care so much about people who do, sacrifice so much of themselves to do this work for other people.
Yeah, and I guess when a big group of people struggle with the same issue, it's no longer an individual problem. It's a failure of the system in a way. Do you see things in the NHS policies and practices that could definitely be improved for the well-being of its staff?
Yeah, I mean, I guess things like we've touched on the way grievances and complaints are handled. I think, that is, people are really scared about having complaints made against them, but also know that that's a really important part of, a democratic health system, and it's really important that we hear patients' experiences.
Would that restrict a doctor's creativity and thinking out of the box a little bit, because they would know that if I don't follow the NICE guideline, I might be in trouble?
Oh yeah, for sure. So if we think to that kind of threat drive activation, people are very, they will absolutely be constrained, and that people will do things because they've got to tick the box rather than because it feels the right thing to do or the most helpful thing to do.
Dr. Redmond, we leave our visionary, moral and ethical questions to the very end, which is now. They are difficult, the difficult questions. What are the statistics of the mental health crisis facing health professionals today in the UK?
That is a difficult question because I don't have that answer on the top of my head.
Do we have a problem? When I talk about mental health crisis, I remember one of our lovely GPs, she was here with us in one of the episodes, and she was talking about attempting suicide and committing suicide, that it's more in this sector than others.
Yeah. I mean, yes, healthcare professionals have a higher rate of suicide than other professions. There are other groups that are also high risk, but that's certainly the case, doctors, dentists in particular. We know that, we've got huge numbers of people leaving the profession, leaving healthcare. We have huge vacancies that are, that there's the kind of cycle of workforce pressures is a really vicious one, because when there are gaps, people have to work harder and fill them, and that makes them unwell or disgruntled and want to leave, and then the gaps are bigger. So we know that is a real challenge, the workforce.
So this exodus from the NHS, and I read that it's on a curve to increase. Do you see this as a crisis or a necessary change?
I think maybe both. Maybe crisis is required for change.
Oh, okay. Yes. How would things be turned around if we don't have enough doctors? And how long would the system be able to sustain itself before it crashes?
I know. Well, I guess it's interesting because, when you talk to people are already saying it's broken. If you're having to wait 9 hours for an ambulance, maybe it's, what is that?
Yeah.
But there are lots of, it also really works really well a lot of the time. We are, I've certainly had lots of very good experiences, with the NHS. So I think it's holding this both ends, and I think it's been a long time that some of these systems have been eroded in terms of privatization, and the way things work now within the NHS is very different to how it was 20 years ago, and it's constantly changing. I don't have easy answers to what would fix it, but I certainly think we need to keep talking about it. And again, there's this, this is a big systemic, wicked problem, but the casualties are not only patients, it is the staff as well, in very real ways. If we look at suicide statistics or, the suffering that people experience, and that I don't have easy answers, but we need to notice it and name it. as a starting point.
You also interviewed Dr. Libby Nugent, hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, about the NHS as death mother. A very provocative title. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So she definitely does a better job than I will do, because she is a clinical psychologist and a group analyst psychotherapist. So she's, coming from that very psychoanalytic world. But my understanding is that there's an archetype of this kind of death mother. So the understanding of a mother who does not have the resources to feed her children. And so we find herself in the impossible position of having to choose between children who to feed, or to not feed herself in order to feed the children. And there's holding this position of being the loving provider and also the withholding figure that can lead to harm. And what kind of impossible position it is for siblings to be kind of fighting over the scraps that are left, and how painful that is, and how painful that is for the mother to have to hold that. But there's also this kind of sense that the children within that continue to look to the mother for feeding and nurturing, and she hasn't got it. Yeah. And so the analogy there is that's what it can feel like to work in the NHS. Like you are looking to the system to feed you, to give you what you need, and it can't. What do you do with that? It's really, really painful. And most often, people are left fighting with each other, over those scraps without necessarily seeing the bigger picture. Yeah.
Share with us the lie that doctors, nurses tell each other, like the toxic belief that would keep them stuck or trapped in a burned out cycle within the NHS.
I think one of them is, we'll just get this done. Like, I'll just get this done and then I'll rest. I'll just get to the end of this
and
list
it never
or
ends.
This shift or, I'll just clear this patient list or finish this shift or get to the end of this placement, and then we'll do something different.
But it's a cycle. Now, if you were appointed the Chief Psychological Safety Officer, I came up with that. I don't know whether this is a thing or not, like for the NHS. If you were appointed in that high position with unlimited visionary power, what would be the inhumane structure that you would dismantle tomorrow?
I mean, the thing that pops into my mind is actually around annual leave for doctors. I feel like not being able to request leave, having to wait till the last minute till you know whether you can have time off for your own wedding, or having to kind of fight for that. I feel...
Is that legal?
Yeah. Well, it happens. I don't know. But that is one of the things I hear so common, particularly for trainee doctors who, the leave is tied up with their placement, and they don't, they only find out very last minute. They can't plan their lives. I feel like that could be different.
Yeah.
I know it's not easy, when you're balancing all kinds of resources, but I feel like people being able to, they've earned leave. Not everyone can be off at the same time, of course, but being able to, have a much more human way of dealing with that would make a huge difference to people. Like, it's very painful for people not to be able to go to their own brother's wedding or have a honeymoon or, know how they could plan rest and recovery and connection with other things in order to sustain them.
Yeah, and to echo what you've previously said 2 hours ago, this is bordering on the unfair.
Yes, right. Exactly. Because these are people who are working really hard. I think particularly resident trainee doctors. I just have such admiration for them. They build
resilience, I guess.
Oh my gosh. Or carry wounds. And it's not, that is an example of how that's not held in the system. If you are being asked so much of, the very least is to be able to say when you're going to, or, request when you're going to be able to take your breaks and know how to plan around that.
Yeah, of course. We mentioned off air the comedy/drama. This is going to hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm still resentful that they call it comedy.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you read the book.
Yeah.
What were your feelings reading such a book? Tell our viewers what the book is all about.
So it's sort of semi-autobiographical by Adam Kay, who's since written a lot of different books about his time as a resident junior doctor on a maternity ward. And it's just written in such a raw way, and the series, I couldn't actually finish watching it. I found it very, that's not work I have done personally. I've not been a doctor in those situations, but it felt really quite traumatic to watch. I couldn't finish it.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. I'm not sure whether it's still on BBC One or not, but I know they should take it off air for everyone's mental health.
I think it's really important, but I think for some people it's very close to home and really difficult to watch because it's so well done. And you really can feel it. And so he has, I think, as you said, that, that there's a lot of like black humor in it, which is obviously a strategy that doctors use a lot to cope with. But it really captures the, the distress and the trauma that working in healthcare exposes people to, and the difficulty of making impossible choices and the impact on personal lives and mental health.
What did you believe early in your career about human nature that you no longer believe?
I guess when I first wanted to become a psychologist, I thought that would have all the answers, and that, you could really understand people, and probably coming from quite a individual lens, the idea of therapy and people being able to, make changes for themselves. I guess the more experienced I get, the more I learn, the more I realize what we don't know. And that's
the scientist's spirit and nature, right?
Yeah. And that there's just something much more fundamental about these simple, basic things around compassion, connection, and creativity, that being able to, acknowledge our humanity and complexity is very hard. It's much harder than coming up with policies and models and, doing stuff, being with things that are painful is really hard for us.
And what's something that you're still struggling with to understand about the human nature?
This isn't very visionary, but it is what popped in my mind. Is just thinking about the recent Traitors series. Don't know if you've watched that.
Everyone, and I have a life to live. I can't have a child with. No, I can't.
You've got better things to do.
Well, we do have a TV, but it's never on. It's only on in Wimbledon tennis.
Oh, yeah.
And if there is a royal event, someone's getting married, someone died, and that's it. I would draw the line. Yeah. But everyone has been telling me about this traitor thing.
Reality
TV. And I can't. Tell me about it.
So it's basically a group of sort of ordinary people who go to this beautiful Scotland castle, and I think they start off with like 22 or so. And in secret, a few of them are chosen as traitors. So they have to basically get away with it until the end, and then they get all the money. So every day they're doing tasks to win money. And every night the traitors murder someone.
Yeah.
So they're eliminating them one by one. And the task of the others is to try and figure out who the traitors are and vote them out.
Gosh, if there is a scenario where all the human evil, the greed, the envy would erupt, that would be it.
I think what erupts really interestingly is how people think they are much better judges of character than they are. So most people go in there and they'll say, oh, I'm really, I'm really good at reading people, so I'm really going to be good at this, or
spotting the traitors.
Okay. And, there's a police detective in the most recent one. There was a psychologist, there's a lawyer, all these people. And they're all absolutely rubbish at it. And what happens is it's a beautiful study in cognitive biases.
Stereotypes?
Yeah, stereotypes. So we've seen people of colour getting voted out earlier than others. Just things like the halo effect. So if someone's like nice and pretty, they are trusted more than someone who, is a bit grumpy or something. And people are not aware of it. People are making nonsense judgments and think they're really good at making these judgments. And I think it's really fascinating because, people, we are so complex, and there's so much in a situation like that where everyone is paranoid, basically, because you can't trust anyone. People behave weirdly and people's judgment is off. It really shows what happens when you don't have psychological safety. People make bad choices and they act weirdly. And so if we think about that in relation to the NHS, we don't want people making mistakes. Yeah. We don't want people having poor judgment.
And I can imagine they feel threatened.
Yes, of course, yeah. And they do weird things, and they don't trust anyone, and they're terrible at the game.
It's just
and it rewards, duplicity and bad behaviour.
Mini projection of what's going on in real life around us.
Exactly.
Maybe
it's
not
really,
the same intensity, but
yeah.
This is
so the thing about what happens when we work in places where there isn't psychological safety, where we don't have trust or transparency, things go wrong. Things, we don't function well.
I'm not sure how to think about this kind of drama or series. Is it a good thing to expose these kind of behaviors and shed light on the negatives in our society, or just toxic environment? I don't want to see that.
Yeah, I know. I feel
feelings.
Like it'd be really helpful to have some, psychological commentary about it to help us see
needs
what we see.
discussion,
Because it's
right?
also weird as a viewer, because sometimes you're feeling like you want the faithfuls to win, and sometimes you want the traitors to win, and it's weird to have, betrayal being rewarded in this way. It's
complicated.
Complicated.
Okay, something lighter, which is AI and technology in psychology. What's your take on it and its role in preventing burnout? Do we have any pitfalls to watch out for?
Yeah, I think AI can be amazing in terms of supporting the cognitive load for things. If you can have a system that helps you prioritize, that helps you, I will use ChatGPT be like I've got all these things on my mind, like, where do I start? And it's actually amazing what it comes back with. And I know, that the key pitfall is that what it does is tell you what you want to hear.
It's so manipulative.
It is. But if you know that, that's okay.
I still feel, especially recently, I'm still using it, but I don't pay for it anymore. I don't want to reward this kind of deception. But only recently I started to feel personal about it. But it's like I feed it a specific PDF that gives specific information and sign, and it gives me easy answers just because of the bandwidth or the energy consumed is whatever. And it does, it knows you. It knows what you do and gives you the answers that you want. But I'm using AI to get solid information, to know the truth about things. It's so deceptive and I don't appreciate it at all. Still using it though.
Yeah, I know. Because it also just lies and makes stuff up. So you've got to be really careful.
Such a liar.
So I think it's like with all these things that you've got to strike a balance between. I think where it comes in with psychology is obviously it can meet a need in terms of it can feel like you're talking to a person. And if you're lonely and worried and, people are using it as a therapist. And I think in part, that can be helpful, but, there've been, some really, and I guess we're all still learning, but there've been some instances where people have, gone on to attempt and complete suicide based on some of these conversations. So the safeguards have not been there in terms of flagging up, But I think that is being built. I've heard that there are situations where it has said, look, this is beyond my scope. You need to speak to a therapist.
Yeah, ChatGPT will never say that. Absolutely not. And I could totally, there is no morality there. I have stories to tell in my job. But I could totally get it if someone, I don't want to test this, but if I convince ChatGPT that I don't have children, no one is dependent on me, I'm sick, tired of this life, I want relief. I'm able, I used to study language, I used to be a writer, I'm able to take ChatGPT's hand for ChatGPT to tell me, okay, jump off a bridge.
Yeah, absolutely.
But other models I've discovered are more impartial, and Gemini is amazing. Perplexity, there are lines, there are ethical guidelines they function on. But ChatGPT, I really dislike it these days.
And I think it's, similar with social media, like balancing the pros and cons and being really discerning about it. It can do wonderful things for connecting us, but it can also be full of misinformation and be very overwhelming. And so again, it's coming back to that sensitivity to what is the impact on you if it starts to, take you in directions that aren't healthy and helpful.
Yeah, but can technology, including AI, take off some stressful parts of healthcare? I can think of admin work, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I think, there are ways, that I don't think was necessarily AI, but things like having email filters so that you are, it's flagging up which emails are sent to you personally and which are sent to everyone in your trust, so that, you're not seeing 1,000 emails, only 5 of them are actually,
that's clever,
for you to answer. Things like, and some of it is about, agreeing habits. But if you're writing an email to someone, including in the subject headline when you need an answer by, not just because you can contact someone immediately doesn't mean there's a requirement or expectation to respond immediately, but that's how we feel. If we were writing letters to people, we'd have a 3-day turnaround and it would be fine. But knowing that, if someone emails you at 4:59 on a Friday, you kind of feel like you're left with something undone. But actually, usually it can wait till Monday.
I personally want to know this one. How would you define resilience?
I think, resilience feels like a really tricky word. It's can trigger an eye roll response in many places because I think it's been misused.
Yeah, to overcome everything, to be a super person.
Yeah.
But would you need it sometimes?
I think resilience for me, I think of those buildings that they build in Japan, that they build with built-in softness and flexibility to withstand earthquakes. So they move with the crisis. They stay standing because of that. So they're not trying to pretend that something bad hasn't happened. They are working with it. And so resilience sometimes might look like stopping. It might look like taking a break. It might look like quitting. It's not the same as, keeping going against all odds. Yeah. I don't think that is resilience. I think that's, perseverance, which can be helpful, but it can also come at a cost. So I think resilience is about adaptation. It's about softness as much as it is about strength, that softness can be a strength. Because if we just keep going, we'll be forced to stop.
Now, if we're looking at the bigger picture, if you could build an effective well-being framework at a hospital, maybe the minimum that every trust should have, what would be, let's say, 3 minimal components be?
At the risk of repeating myself, kind of noticing and naming the challenges, noticing and naming the harm. And that means hearing people. That means making space for people to be heard. What you hear often is related to basic humanity. It's people having time to go to the toilet when they're on shift. It's people, feeling that they can get enough rest, that they're not going home burdened by distress and worry. The third thing is about connection between people, that's recognizing how important relationships are. And that means, creating and investing in enabling people to build relationships so that they can support each other, but also being better at responding to things when they're difficult. And so that it isn't, that it feels psychologically safe, which doesn't just mean being nice all the time, but being able to deal with conflicts and bad behaviour well too.
Dr. Paula Redmond, you've told us today that when work hurts, it's not because we're weak. It's because we sometimes function within systems that can lose their humanity. You told us that compassion, creativity are not soft concepts. They are foundational to our well-being and mental health. What you do in your podcast is incredibly important because it discusses or sheds light on experiences that a lot of us struggle with, and silently, whether we are part of the NHS staff or not. We talked about burnout, we talked about trauma, but most importantly, we talked about how to deal with them and to stay hopefully resilient in the face of it all and within systems that can sometimes dehumanize us. So when work hurts, courage could lead the way. Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.